I'm Paige Thacker. I'm with the Cooperative Extension Office, and it's my pleasure to introduce Celia Vuocolo as your next speaker. A little bit about Celia. She's been working in wildlife conservation for over 10 years. She's the Working Lands for Wildlife Pollinator Coordinator and promotes pollinator conservation on working landscapes. Celia's position is supported by a partnership between Quail Forever and USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. Before coming to her current position, Celia worked as the private lands biologist for Northern Virginia, wildlife habitat and stewardship specialist for the Piedmont Environmental Council, and completed a Smithsonian Graduate Fellowship with the Virginia Working Landscapes Program. Celia is passionate about pollinator conservation, particularly bumblebees, and has spent time surveying and studying the effects of a gut parasite on local bumblebee populations for her graduate studies at George Mason University. She's currently working towards a master's in natural resources in restoration, ecology, and habitat management, and at the University of Idaho. And without further ado, Celia, tell us about the Virginia native bees.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining me on this, I guess, your last session of the day. It looks like it's been fantastic symposium so far, lots of great sessions and information shared. So welcome. Am I not going to be able to do it from here?
So shoot towards the one. She clicks the keyboard
And then it works. Thank you for that pro tip.
Click somewhere around
here. I tried it out before I started it at work. It's probably because of the
try it now.
There it goes.
Magical.
Thank you. So my presentation is about, I think we have an hour for the whole session, about 50 minutes. We'll do 10 minutes worth of questions. But I'm really hoping to leave you all feeling informed and inspired to help support our native bees here in Virginia. I'm going to start with just kind of a pollinator primer, as I like to call it. So talk to you a little bit about pollination biology. And then I'm going to segue into going over, who our native bees are in Virginia, and then leave you guys with some tips for creating pollinator habitat, and also run through some of my favorite native plants for bees and some resources at the end. So I'm sure you're all here today because you recognize that supporting our Virginia native bees is important, and rightfully so, since the majority of plant species on our planet rely on animal pollinators to reproduce. And we rely on plants for a number of reasons. So clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, food for ourselves and animals, the list goes on. And as you all know, native plants are the backbone of healthy ecosystems. And native bees are a big part of our ecosystems as well. And in the United States, we actually have the highest bee species richness of any country, which is pretty remarkable. And half of them are not found anywhere else in the world. I'm sure many of you probably saw that National Geographic article that came out back in 2019, really kind of spelled some gloom and doom for a lot of our insect species, and it's true, we have a lot of issues going on now with our insect populations globally, and bees are certainly not immune to that. Bees and a lot of other wildlife species are suffering the effects of what I call kind of the big four. So, we start off with pathogens, and what I mean by that are, particularly for bees, are parasites and diseases, and of course we have pesticides, climate change, and then habitat loss and degradation. So you'll see here on the slide, I have a microscope picture of the gut parasite Nosema. So this is something I spent some time studying. And this is a parasite that's actually passed between bumblebees and honeybees. And the issue with parasites like this, and just viruses and bacteria within these bee communities, is that they can be passed from commercial bumblebee production systems and honeybee production systems to wild bee communities. And they're very difficult to address and diagnose and treat in wild bees. Of course, we have pesticides as well, and if pesticides don't outright kill bees, they can have other effects like suppressing their immune systems and just creating a lot of issues, a lot of neurological issues. So pathogens and pesticides can kind of work in tandem with each other and really cause a lot of problems. Climate change, of course, is a big one, and like many other wildlife species, we're still trying to learn all of the potential effects that climate change is going to have on our bees, but I'll highlight this in two main ways. We know that some bees are actually changing their ranges as a result to warming temperatures. So, for example, bumblebees, there was a study several years ago that bumblebees in North America and in Europe are actually moving their ranges northward and up in elevation to kind of escape the heat. Another issue that climate change brings about is that it changes the bloom times of plants and also when certain bees emerge. And you're going to learn why that's really an issue a little bit later, but you know, bees and flowers are missing each other. That's called like a theological gap that can really create a lot of issues. And of course, habitat loss is a big one. And habitat loss isn't always what people think it is. You know, like a really overly manicured lawn, for instance, with no flowers is habitat loss to a bee. And you know, we've got a lot of lawn in this country, 50 million acres. It's our fourth largest crop. We spend a lot of time and resources keeping it up. So before we can walk through how we can get your property to look like this, or even this, I want to first talk to you a little bit about why bees select the flowers that they do. You know, what are the things that are driving them to come visit your yard and forage on your flowers? I've got this slide from Sam Droege, who's one of the top bee experts really in the world, and we're lucky enough to have him right over here at the Tuxedo Wildlife Refuge in Maryland, if anyone's familiar. I really like this message because I really do think that in order to save bees, you have to be protecting and planting the right kind of native plants for them, because it is really all about the pollen. And pollen is a really interesting substance. You know, it has, of course, the genetic material of the mother plant, but it's also highly nutritious, which is why animal pollinators seek it out and collect it. And the main reasons they're collecting it, if they're not just outright eating it, is they're bringing it back to feed their young. And bees are certainly one of those group of species that does that. And they're often regarded as such great pollinators because they are actively collecting pollen and moving it from plant to plant. Now, they're not doing that on purpose. They're attaching it to themselves, and they're growing along in their foraging journey. It just so happens that the pollen ends up moving from plant to plant, essentially. And like I said, pollen's really extremely interesting stuff. It's got proteins, sugars, lipids, fiber, minerals, and a whole bunch of vitamins in it. And this is why it's such a fantastic substance. And you'll notice here that I've got a couple of different percentage ranges next to each of these components. And that's because the nutrient composition varies by plant species. And this is important because this is what also drives certain pollinators to be interested in certain plants. So you have different, and it makes sense, you know, like our food is not created equal. Like a piece of cheese and an apple is not going to have the same nutritional content, right? Same thing with pollen. And nectar. Nectar is another big one too. Plants only produce nectar to attract pollinators. There's no other purpose for it at all. It's energetically very expensive for them to make. So it's really just about bringing in the right pollinators. And it's not just sugar water. There are amino acids, antioxidants, lipids, and other things in nectar that are, once again, very attractive to a lot of animals. Not every plant species needs an animal pollinator to help it reproduce. So we have a lot of wind pollinated plants. Those are the ones that tend to give us allergies in the springtime. So a lot of our grasses and a lot of our trees, things like that. But the ones that do require animal pollination have certain strategies for attracting the right pollinator for the right job. So my little way of thinking about it is some plants like to just invite everybody. So I call these party plants, and I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. And their strategy is, hey, I'm going to offer all this pollen, all this nectar, and I'm going to be physically available, meaning that these are flowers usually that are very like open, like you know, something like a daisy, which it's really easy to access those components. The second one I like to call like the invitation only plants. So these are plants that actually exclude all but the right pollinators from allowing, and a lot of that's based on their morphology. And I have a cool example of that. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rules. These are kind of, generalities, and there's some plants that kind of fall in between. There's a lot of gray area, but generally speaking, this is kind of the way it works. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with mountain mint. So this is short-toothed mountain mint. We have a bunch of different mountain mint species that are native to Virginia. If you want a plant that's going to eat up a bunch of grass, this is definitely one of those, but it needs a lot of space. And you can kind of see it's acting as like a virtual landing pad for insects, and can't really see it now, but when we were there on this field walk, I mean, it was just crawling with insects. And mountain mint always, ends up being listed really high up on like a lot of studies for just its ability to attract a huge diversity of insect pollinators. So always a great one to have around. This is bottle gentian, which is a Virginia native plant, and it's one of those invite-only plants, and it does that by basically its flower structure. So it never completely opens. So this is what the flower looks like, and the only bees that are really able to get down into the flower and are strong enough are bumblebees. So they basically pry it open and shimmy themselves down there to get the pollen and the nectar. What's also really cool about this plant is the tips of the petals turn white when it's been pollinated. And that signals to other like bumblebees, hey, like somebody's already been here, please don't violate me again, essentially. And that kind of, once again, doesn't kind of eliminates that extra handling time of the flower. So we talked a little bit about strategies broadly, and this is kind of getting a little bit more detailed, but going back in time a little bit. So flowers and bees started diversifying about 100 million years ago at the same time. So what that means is we started seeing in the fossil records lots and lots of species, like a radiation of species on both sides. So what we think is that they kind of drove each other's evolution. So they've had millions of years of working together to sort of figure out those really intricate relationships. So beyond just those two strategies I've mentioned, there are what we call pollinator syndromes, and it's basically a plant kind of advertising to certain pollinators that they want to attract. So if you look on the side here, the trait that certain plants will have, whether it's color or nectar guides, odor, pollen, flower shape, all of those are designed to try and bring the right one to the plant. So as you're thinking about planning for pollinators, it's really key to just recognize that there's just so many relationships out there between plants and bees. So what you really want to start thinking about is how can you bring a diversity of plants to your landscape so that you can support as many insects as possible, right? And this is a really great picture. This is a meadow in Rappahannock County, and they have, pretty good diversity. They have yellow flowers, purple flowers, pink flowers, orange, different shapes, different heights of plants, and all those things are important in pollinator habitat. So let's talk a little bit about who our pollinators are in Virginia. We mainly have insects as pollinators in our state, and we're going to be talking about bees today, which is why this is highlighted. We do have some hummingbirds, of course. In other parts of the country, we have some bats that pollinate. We have birds, and then around the world, mammals and other species as well will do pollinating. But here we basically just have insects for the most part. So here's a little overview of some of our native bees. So like I mentioned earlier, we have almost 3,600 bee species in the US. We have about 460 that have been recorded in Virginia, which is a pretty good diversity. Unfortunately, we do have 9 species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. One of them, the rusty patch bumblebee, which is federally endangered, is found in Virginia. We have 7 species of called masked bees that are listed as endangered in Hawaii. And then we have one other bumblebee that's only found in the Pacific Northwest. I really want to emphasize too that the majority of our native bees are solitary. What that means is that they do not form colonies or hives. And that's really important to understand because it affects their behavior. So when we have solitary species, they don't have the same aggressive tendencies to say, like a yellow jacket, for instance, which is not a bee, it's a wasp, but they are a colonial species and they tend to be territorial, and that's how people get stung. Native bees, for the most part, the ones that are solitary are not like that. It pretty much is like this life cycle chart here where you have a queen that typically overwinters by herself, maybe has mated the year before, maybe when she emerges in the spring or summer. And then she finds her nesting substrate, lays an egg, provisions it with a pollen ball, and then it hatches and the larva consumes the pollen ball and then goes on its way, essentially. And that's really the life cycle of a lot of our bees. So we have about 6 groups of bees or families in Virginia, and I'm going to go through each one of these. I'm going to start with Apidae. So these are our big-bodied bees. So bumblebees, the honeybee, and carpenter bees are in this family. Mostly social bees. There are some solitary bees as well in that family. Then we go down to our mason bees or leafcutter bees. So these guys are all solitary. This is the family that uses native bee houses. You probably recognize that. Next we have mining bees. These are solitary. Same thing with oil bees. Sweat bees are actually our largest bee family globally. They have the most amount of species. Primarily solitary. They do have 1 or 2 like social families, I think, in there. I mean, species. And then the plasterer bees are also solitary. So, yeah. So this is a nice little chart. Just look at the outside, because I know we're not going to talk about that inner ring there, but that outer ring is representative of the number of species in each family that are found in the United States, and it's representative of which families have the most in our country, essentially. So, for example, if you look here, the blue section belongs to Adrenidae, so the mining bees. So they're the family that actually has the most species of bees in our country, which is interesting. Followed by Apidae, so they're the next largest. And then you have, let's see, Megachilidae is right here, number 3. I was really surprised that the sweat bees don't have more of a presence here, since they are the largest global bee family, but hey. And then last but not least, we have our Caletidae, and then the oil bees, the Melitidae, is that little tiny like piece right there. They're a very small bee family, so that makes sense. I wanted to start off just talking about our bees of conservation concern here in Virginia, because they're really the ones that I feel warrant the most amount of attention, and especially as gardeners and land managers. I should say a little bit of a caveat here that our wild bees are extremely understudied. I mean, there was a paper that just came out that talked about, they call it the persistent data gap in our knowledge in the United States. Well, really, it's a global issue, but specifically this paper was looking at the United States. And we just don't even know what all of the species like distributions or ranges are. Like it's just how, unfortunately how it is. So, but I do feel comfortable putting these 2 groups forward. I mean, bumblebees are well enough researched that we know that there's issues going on. And then pollen specialist bees, the same as well. Pollen specialist bees are not necessarily a family. It's actually describing a foraging behavior, and they exist across all families of bees. And basically what that means is pollen specialist bees only collect pollen from certain plants. And they could be something as specific as this example I have on my slide here, this mining bee, where that mining bee only collects pollen from 2 species of plants, and that's it. There's other species that will collect pollen from like a genus. So you have maybe one that collects from a genus of like goldenrod, and there's about 41 species of goldenrod in Virginia, for example. But the issue with specialist bees is that if their host plants aren't in the landscape, they are not going to be either. And that problem with climate change, where you're changing bloom times of certain plants that they really rely on, that's another big issue. We have 96 species of specialist bees kind of in the mid-Atlantic Northeast region. 41 of those species are rare. So these are typically not very common bees. And the bee family with the most specialist is actually the mining bees. So they've got about half of our region's pollen specialist bees in their family. We're going to be seeing a lot of them very soon. I think in the next few weeks, they're going to really start to begin emerging because they're most abundant in the spring. They nest in the ground and they are solitary. Sometimes they'll nest in what we call aggregations. So you see a lot of these different holes in the ground, but each hole represents basically one queen bee who's going in and laying a couple of eggs and then provisioning them and then moving off. So it's not, sometimes though people will see this, a lot of bee activity and think it's like a colony, but it's really not. This is a really cool example of a mining bee pollen specialist and its host plant. I really love golden Alexanders. They're kind of like an underappreciated, underused native plant, in my opinion. They're obviously they support this guy, but they also are the host plant for the black swallowtail butterfly, which is a really beautiful butterfly. They also bloom at a time that we don't have a lot of other native perennials blooming, so they're like an early bloomer. Just a cool plant. I really like it. So moving along to the oil bees. So these guys are kind of considered a species or family. There's just not a lot of them, and there's only 6 to 10 species in the United States, like anywhere. Very, very highly specialized, and they're called oil bees because they actually collect like this oil-like substance from their host plants. So these host plants create this basically oil as opposed to nectar as an attractant. And they use the oil to actually line their nest cells where they're laying their eggs in the ground. They feed their the pollen to their young, and the adults apparently will just forage on any old plant. They really just need those host plants to support their young. And here's an example. So we have loosestrife species in Virginia. I forget how many we have, maybe like 6. So it's not an uncommon plant, but these bees are extremely rare, very understudied because they're just extremely hard to find. But we do have at least 2 species that will host on loosestrife. And it is one of those plants that creates oil rather than nectar. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat and it says, Katie McCoy studies. Do we know how many bees in Virginia are non-native?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but we do have a decent amount of non-native and actually what's considered invasive bee species. So there's a lot I know of research going on with that in kind of the Northern Virginia, Washington, DC area, because that is kind of a hot spot for a lot of invasive bees coming in. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but there's a presence for sure. So bumblebees, that's our next group of bees that I really want to emphasize that are of conservation concern. And unlike pollen specialists, these guys all are under one genus, which is the bombus genus. So they are all related to each other. They are one of my favorites, of course. I've spent some time studying them, and they're just a fantastic little bee. They're found in almost every continent. They do prefer kind of more like the temperate, cooler regions of the world. Very furry, as you can see, and a lot of that's just to help them thermoregulate themselves, but it also makes them really good pollinators because they are able to just sort of, you know, as they're foraging, the pollen just sticks to them and they're just moving along. They're really great. They are in terms of pollinating orchards and other vegetable production like facilities. There are certain species that are commercially available and used in like greenhouse operations and things like that. They are more efficient than honeybees with pollinating certain plants. Blueberries in particular, they're extremely good at. And they are, we call them primitively eusocial in that they do create a small colony, usually underground, but it's seasonal. So you have a queen bumblebee that comes out in the spring, starts laying eggs underground, and then by the summer you'll have some males and some workers and some new queens, but the whole colony dies off by the end of the summer, and you only have the new queen that overwinters and starts it over again. So we have about 11 species of bumblebees that are, I would say, present in Northern Virginia where we live. I typically start seeing bumblebees emerging like the 1st or 2nd week in April. And it's usually the 2-spotted bumblebee. This guy on top is our earliest emerging bumblebee. followed by the brown belted bumblebee, and then the common eastern bumblebee right here in the middle. The common eastern has probably the longest life cycle. It comes out in April, and I'll see it well into October. So it's just really interesting because most of the other ones don't last that long. Unfortunately, there are a couple on here that are in trouble. So we're seeing some pretty significant population declines of the yellow bumblebee and where's the other one? Black and gold bumblebee. Would not be surprised if they're not put forward for endangered listing status in the next like 5 years. We do unfortunately have the American bumblebee, which has been petitioned, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So the rusty patch bumblebee is on the federally endangered list. That was, I think, 2017. It was listed, and that's because it's really declined from like over 90% of its range in the last 20 years. So that's a really precipitous decline of any species. We actually thought it was completely gone from the mid-Atlantic until we had a citizen scientist with the Smithsonian find it at Sky Meadows State Park in Fauquier, of all places, in 2014. That was a really cool find because it kind of brought some renewed interest from the Department of Conservation and Recreation to really look more closely for the species. And they've since gone on to find it in 4 counties in the Blue Ridge. So like Augusta, Bath, Rockingham, and Highland counties are kind of the stronghold for the species in Virginia. Sadly, did not find any more in Fauquier, just that one species, that one individual. And for this one, the main driver of decline is that nosema parasite that I had mentioned earlier. So that makes it really tricky to try and conserve the species when it's predominantly being declining due to disease. The American bumblebee is very similar kind of a situation. This one's being actively reviewed for listing under the ESA by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They proposed it back in 2021. What's neat about this one is that unlike the rusty patch, it's still common enough where it might actually show up in your backyard. Like I've had it in my yard before. I live over in Warrenton. So, which is kind of comforting in a way because it really goes to show that, if you put plants out for these pollinators, it's going to make a difference. So just quickly, some other Virginia bees that we have. I've always got to talk about the carpenter bee because that's one that a lot of folks will ask questions on. In the same family as bumblebees and looks very similar too. The big difference is that it's got this kind of shiny bum, as I call it. So its thorax is completely hairless, which is why you can almost see like a reflection sometimes if it's flying around outside. And bumblebees have a ton of hair. Honeybee, of course, very iconic species. So I always like to touch on it, even though it is non-native and it is domesticated. So originally from Europe, we brought it over here when we began colonizing North America. It's one of the few truly eusocial bees in the world. Very complex social situation. They have a caste system. All the bees have different jobs. Really interesting stuff. It was the one that this is the one bee that is susceptible to colony collapse disorder, and that was a big PR story about 20 or 30 years ago, which was great because it really did, I think, cause a lot more focus to be put on bees in general. So it's kind of a poster child for conservation in a way. However, so much of how we think about bees as a society is built around the honeybee, but its biology is so different from so many of our native bees. So you kind of have to relearn what you thought you know about bees because so much of it is based on the honeybee. So our mason and our leafcutter bees, what I really like about these guys that's different from a lot of other bees is that their pollen collecting hair is actually on the underside of their abdomen, which is neat. Most other bees, collect pollen and kind of stick it on their back legs, but these guys, it's right on their abdomens. They nest in cavities, so these are like tube-like structures. So in the wild, this would be, like dead standing flower stems of like goldenrod or something like that's more rigid, or even old wood, woody debris. And depending on the species, they'll use either mud or leaves to kind of provision their little nest cells. And then the blue orchard mason bee is one that most people are familiar with because they are the used quite commonly in orchard pollination. I took this picture in my front yard. So this is a little red maple sapling that a leaf cutter had been kind of busily working on. So if you find, tends to mostly be trees that it seems that they like to, kind of cut away, but they have very powerful jaws and they'll just kind of cut these perfectly concentric circles and take that piece back to their little nest cell that they're working on. Sweat bees. Most people are familiar with sweat bees. They're little guys that land on your skin in the summer and like drink your sweat. They tend to be mostly habitat generalists in our part of the world, and we have a lot of really neat green, shiny, metallic sweat bees. So if you see a little green bee, it's probably these guys. They are, as I mentioned earlier, the largest bee family globally. And then last but not least, of course, we have our plasterer bees. They're called this because they actually line those nest cells, once again, solitary bees. They line those nest cells with these like mouth secretions and it looks like plaster, so hence the name. This is the family that's got the 7 species in Hawaii that are federally endangered. And there's actually a really amazing diversity of this genera in Hawaii. We only have about 3 genera in our region, so they're not well represented. Very understudied of all the bee families, though not a whole lot of info out there. So just to kind of recap, here's our 6th group of bees here in Virginia. Do I have next? Right, so I thought this is a really neat graph. Just chart here of the country because it shows our expected bee species richness, and it says expected because once again, there's so much like gaps in data that we don't have all the information we need, but based on what we do have, it actually shows a really remarkable hotspot. It's a global hotspot actually for bee diversity in the Southwest in California. So this is where we have the most amount of bee species, but looking at Virginia, I mean, we're pretty good. We're right up there. So just now that we've talked a lot about just our bee biology and pollination biology, we're going to talk about habitat. And these 4 components of habitat, food, water, space, and cover, no matter what wildlife species you're managing for, you're going to be tweaking these 4 components to meet their needs essentially. When it comes to pollinators, I'm really just going to focus on food and cover because those are really kind of our main components for these guys. Pollinator habitat is not complicated. It just requires a little bit of thought. And these are my kind of big 3 overarching suggestions to think about. Putting in diverse forage, so diversity of plants, making sure you have nesting opportunities or protecting any that already exist. And trying to be as pesticide-free as possible or just conscious with your insecticide use. And another point I really want to drive home is that pollinators use all types of habitat. I think this is not a concept that's widely pushed when it comes to talking about pollinator habitat. A lot of times it's, the pollinator gardens or the meadows, and those are all really important too, but they're going to be using forests. They use riparian areas, transitional areas, and the more diverse habitat you have in a landscape, the more diverse bee population you will have. So just something to think about. So these are my 6 tips kind of creating for pollinator habitat. And I'm going to go through each of these as we go along. But the big picture for me is planting natives and just trying to be as messy of a gardener as possible and trying to really plant a suite of flowers or trees, flowering plants that bloom through the entire growing season. This is a list that's just for the mid-Atlantic, so some species not native to Virginia, but you can see this is all perennials. There's 11 species, and you basically have March to October covered. So this is kind of what you want to look to aim for. Try and avoid cultivars if you can. I know that's tricky sometimes because a lot of our big name nurseries and box stores mainly have cultivars of native plants, but what happens is when you have something like this where there's like a double bloom or the leaves are a different color, all the different tweaks that happen to cultivars wildlife and pollinators may not recognize the plant, or because the energy outputs of the plants have been manipulated, they might not produce pollen, or they might not produce nectar. So I just say, try and get straight species, and the place to go for those are your local native plant nurseries.
Do the pollinators still recognize the double bloom flower?
Not always. It depends on the pollinator and it depends on the species. So, and that's the thing that's tricky, is we don't have enough information to know all of what cultivars are okay and which ones aren't. So, and the other big problem too with purchasing plants from some of those bigger stores is a lot of times they're treated with pesticides, which kind of obviously would directly go against what you're trying to achieve. That's why, once again, going to your local native plant nursery is a good bet. Talked about this a lot, just, of course I had to mention it again. Diversity of flower shape and color is just really critical. Native trees and shrubs. I actually have a whole presentation that's just on pollinators and trees. But yeah, these are just really, really critical early nectar and pollen source for a lot of our early bees. If you think about it, in the East, we don't have a lot of native perennial blooming flowers. That's because it's really the trees and the shrubs that are blooming. So those bees and other pollinators that are out at that time of year, this is what they need to have to really sustain themselves. It's tricky sometimes. I know if you're short on space, hard to get a tree or a couple trees in there, but if you can at least get like one small tree or a flowering shrub, that would be great. And don't, overlook your existing trees. Like red maple is a fantastic tree for pollinators. It really is. And, in the early spring, I mean, you'll have bumblebees, honeybees, mining bees. Everybody will be on this. And it also goes to show too, you don't have to have a super showy plant to attract pollinators, because if you remember, all plants are using different strategies, and it's not always about appearance. There's other things too. Cover is a little bit trickier because you're really thinking about two different types of cover. You're thinking about nesting versus overwintering sites. And there's not really a good way to attract ground nesting bees to your yard. They just kind of show up, which is why I have just like observe where the bees go. If you see them using, part of your yard, I just say try and protect it from kids and dogs. That's how it is in my house anyway. Native bee houses, I didn't have enough time to really go into that in great detail for this presentation. There's a lot of caveats with using those. I would just say, make sure you do your research and you're getting the right size tubes and the right type of house before you put one up. And then, aside from our bees that will use like leaf piles and compost to overwinter, we also have a lot of other important insects that will be using these kind of rougher areas. So always great to have that. If you want to use your dead flower stems to provide habitat for those mason bees and leafcutter bees, just make sure you leave them standing for at least a year. And that's because if a bee lays eggs in April and then seals it off, depending on the species, it might not hatch out again until the following April. So just something to think about. Yes.
There's a question in the chat about Japanese maples support bees.
No, they don't, unfortunately. Yeah, so that's one of those landscape trees that unfortunately doesn't have a whole lot of habitat value. And I'm trying to think if there's any other species that it supports, but nothing comes to mind, unfortunately. So it's really just those like red maples, those native maples.
What other question?
That's on a slide. It has its own slide, don't worry.
No. Then another question, Asian jumping worm impact on ground nesting bees?
Yeah, I've seen that question come up before, and I don't believe there's really any research that's looked directly at the Asian jumping worm. I think for it to affect ground nesting bees, you'd have to have a really, really high density of, high population of those jumping worms to affect, and they'd have to be in the same spot that a ground nesting bee would. So I don't know. I'll have to look it up and see if anyone's working on it.
Okay.
Any other ones?
Not yet.
No. You may recognize this is one of my favorite places to go and hike. This is the Manassas battlefields. I really love this little rough strip of just this little shrubby hedgerow. This is like 5 in between Battery Heights and Deep Cut, I think. And it's great too, because, you know, I love bobwhite quail, and I'm sure quail are using it. They have a quail population there in the park, but it's really valuable pollinator habitat. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is that these kind of messy areas are not highly disturbed, which is really great for ground nesting bees, and it allows, you know, a lot of leaf litter and other stuff to kind of pile up. There's also a really high diversity of plants in these kind of transitional areas. You'll have grasses, forbs, but then you'll also have trees and shrubs as well. So you've got a lot of different great stuff. So if you've got something like this at your property, just, you know, protect it, but also make sure you're managing for invasive species. That's a big thing. So I used to actually live in a townhouse in Bristow here, so I had to get really thrifty with what native plants I could like cram into my really tiny yard. So I definitely understand some people don't have a lot of space, and there's, in my experience, there's kind of two different ways you can go at it. You can pick a plant that's really going to attract a wealth of pollinators, so like goldenrods or mountain mints or something like that. Just know that it's probably, that's all it's going to be. Or you could go another way, which is trying to pick some of the more well-behaved natives, like your coreopsis or phlox. Maybe those go in a container. You can have some sort of, you know, both things happening at the same time. Still try and pick a plant for each season if you can. And just realize that some plants do better than others in pots when it comes to natives, but Plant Nova Natives is a really great fact sheet on container gardening. If you go to their website, a lot of good info. And I'm going to kind of close out this section with just talking about pollen specialist bees, because I really talked a lot about those, and it's good for you to know kind of what plants might support them. I was really surprised that willows are so high up on the list for the amount of pollen specialist bees they support. They're a tough species, tough genera, because there's not a lot of them in the nursery trade, so they're kind of hard to come by unless they're just occurring naturally, you know, in your yard. But also take notice too that, you know, native sunflowers, asters, and goldenrods are plants that you see in a lot of pollinator habitat plantings anyway. So you know, you don't have to get really fancy with supporting pollen specialist bees, because some of these more common plants are there and are going to help you out. Trees and shrubs, there's also some really great species that will support specialist bees. So the hollies, believe it or not, American holly, winterberry, inkberry, a lot of those are very supportive of specialist bees. The dogwoods, I just want to point out, those are more of like the shrubby dogwoods. So like red osier dogwood, there's like gray dogwood, not flowering dogwood. It's specifically those kind of shrubbier ones. And of course, redbud, let's see, New Jersey tea and vaccinium are on there too. And just some other quick considerations for specialist bees. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. I'll be done shortly. So just a couple other considerations. You know, specialist bees are mostly out in the summer, so that makes sense. That's kind of the peak period of time for most of our bees anyway. So that's when most species are out. And I already mentioned this before, you know, a lot of our common pollinator plants will support them, but then you might want to think about throwing some of the rare ones in there, like we talked about loosestrife, which there are at least one species of loosestrife I do see offered by some native plant nurseries in the area. I see Maryland golden aster being offered too. Something to think about. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of starts just me showing you guys some plants, but kind of big picture here though, it's really about the right plant, putting the right plant in the right place. And that goes back to just knowing your property, you know, kind of what your basic soils are. Is it loamy? Is it clay? Most of the time it's going to be clay in this area. You know, what the light is like. Is it full sun, shady? Is it, you know, wet soil, not wet soil? And then trying to put plants together that exist in the same plant communities is great. And that takes a little bit of research and reading, but that's really critical. Redbud, see Nancy, I had it on here. Yeah, this is a really great one. This is one of my favorites. It's, you know, very common in our landscape, but it's really, really critical, important early nectar source for queen bumblebees, those early mining bees, honeybees as they're emerging. And then some of the the leaf cutter and mason bees as well. It hosts 19 species of native caterpillars, so which is pretty incredible. And then it has that, I think, one specialist bee that it hosts. And it's a pretty good plant for like a landscape. You can find it pretty easily in the nursery. Winterberry, so I did talk about the hollies a little bit before that too. So it does support a lot of specialist bees, but it's also extremely attractive to honeybees, wasps, and like other native bees. I don't know why that is. I mean, the flowers are not very showy, but once again, it doesn't always have to be about being super pretty to attract pollinators. Has berries that persist in the winter, so it's great for birds. Native viburnums, and we've got a couple of species in this area. They're another species that really quite beautiful, flowering early spring, hosts a ton of caterpillars, 104 species. And then we'll put out fruit in the late fall. I mean, it's late summer, early fall for those migrating birds. Mountain mints, the bee pollinator plant. I did talk about these a little bit before. Really need some space with these guys. They're not a true mint, but they act like it. And they are very strong shouldered plants, so just beware. Wild bergamot, it's another one of my personal favorites. They're really important bumblebee plants. So a couple of those species I talked about earlier that haven't been listed yet, they really, for some reason, really love this plant. And, also you'll get hummingbirds and butterflies nectaring on this as well. Host 3 specialist bees, just a really great all around plant. Asters. Asters and goldenrods are really like the rock stars when it comes to supporting bees and other pollinators. I mean, 6 specialist bees, host 112 species, which is a lot for a perennial. Mostly the trees are the ones that are hosting that large of a number. There's an aster for every situation, I think I always like to say. Blazing star is a really great one if you're looking to do a butterfly garden. For some reason, monarchs really love these guys. They do tend to flop because they are prairie plants. So you want to make sure you're planting them with other plants that can kind of help hold it up. And last but not least, these guys will be coming out soon before we even know it. The Virginia bluebell. They do pretty good in just regular garden soil. I have some in my house, just in a garden bed. I love watching queen bumblebees just nectar off of these guys in the springtime. It's just really special. And then resources. Xerxes is a really great website. They've got everything you could possibly ever want to know about bees. They're my go-to. A lot of really good fact sheets for sure. These are some of my favorite books. Attracting Native Pollinators is a really good guide to kind of get you started, just understanding pollinator concepts and habitat. I'm still reading the one in the middle. I haven't got through that one yet. These are just some stuff if you want to learn how to identify bees. These are kind of written for the lay person. And big plug for your local native plant campaign, because that's really where you want to start. And then learning your plants beyond just, going through the Nova Natives Guide, the Digital Atlas of Virginia and DCR's Natural Heritage Program. That's where you're going to learn about your plant communities. Okay. And I'll speed through that. Sorry about that. Okay, that's it. Any questions? Yes.
Are all bees pollinators?
Yes. For the most part, actually, wait, I'm going to take that back because there are some species, kleptoparasites. So they basically will go into like a bee's. This is mostly, I'm thinking for bumblebees, there's a couple of kleptoparasites. Well, they'll go into a colony and lay their eggs and sort of like take over essentially. So those kinds of species are not predominantly going out and doing as much pollen foraging and things like that. They might just nectar to survive. And then because they don't have to provision pollen for their little guys because they're taking over somebody else's nest, not as much, but the majority of bees are pollinators. Yeah. Yeah.
So you were talking about the bumblebees that have all the hair.
Yeah.
Collect so much pollen. Mm-hmm. Now, what happens, and I know they go to different flowers and they pollinate them, but pollen, you said, is also a source of food.
Yeah.
So is that pollen then wasted or is it eaten by others? Like they take it to their hives or?
Yes, and that's a good question. I should have been a little bit more precise with my language on that too. So they're not doing the pollination for free, basically. They're not leaving pollen behind. It's just a matter of them, as they're collecting pollen, on their back legs, it gets stuck to their hair. They're just leaving it behind by accident. So there's, yeah, does that makes
No,
sense.
my question is that the plants are putting so much energy
Mm.
into producing flowers,
Yeah.
producing pollen, and it's acting as a food source as well.
Yeah.
But then it's getting wasted on the hair of the bees. Is where I'm going with the thought.
But for a plant, it's not being wasted because the bee is the only way that their pollen, which is their genetic material, is getting moved anywhere. Otherwise, it would just stay on the plant. So they actually want the bee to get as much pollen on it as possible. And some plants even have these physical characteristics where like the anthers, which is where the pollen is contained, will like hang down and there'll be nectar inside and the bee actually hits the pollen as it goes in to go for the nectar. So they actually want to try and get as much pollen on the bee as possible. That's yeah, the answer. Okay. Yes.
How do you know if a queen has laid an egg in a stalk in your yard?
Some bees, you don't always know, but if you look at the top of the, like the reed or the dead stem, sometimes they'll seal it with like mud or leaves. Other times, if it's like a stem that should not be hollow and you look down and you see like there's a hollow part, it means somebody's chewed down it and laid eggs in there.
So the flower will be gone.
Yes, yeah, basically.
Am I an evil person if I kill carpenter bees?
No, I think there's a lot worse things you could do in the world to be considered an evil person. No, and carpenter bees are tricky. I mean, they can be a nuisance species for sure. And I've heard all sorts of things of people trying different techniques to try and get them away, like putting tea tree oil on like the wood surfaces. Sometimes I have heard that people can hang like brown paper bags that look like yellow white-faced hornet nests like near there, they'll go away. I mean, it's tricky. You got to do what you got to do because they will chew up the side of. Yeah, I've seen some significant damage. Yeah. Yeah. Leaving other options for them as much as possible is a good. Yeah.
If you burrowing into a fence flat, and I painted them, and they went away.
That works, I think, like 70% of the time. Sometimes they'll just chew right through. I've seen it like where they'll just still do it, but yeah, painting or staining.
I have a cute little house, I got a little hole in it, they go in the hole and they can't get out. So it collects and then.
I've seen those before. Yes, yeah. They sell them at like the co-op and stuff. Yes, go ahead. Jerry.
My neighbor wants to introduce honeybees, like a honeybee hive. Now, is that more the merrier with bees or is that competition for native bees?
It can be competition for native bees. I mean, the more research that we do over the years, the more it does become obvious that there are some competition happening, especially with like its close cousins, like the bumblebees, because they have some similarities in how they forage. So yeah, I would say that, and my advice is usually if you're gonna bring in a hive or a couple hives, to try and get as much natives on the landscape so that there's enough to go around, basically. So, yeah. What's happening? Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so I'm making a space pollinator habitat for my HOA, and the Girl Scouts want to put in a bee house. Do you have a recommended source of to not become slumlords and like this?
Yeah. Yeah, so if you go to Xerxes, put that site back up. They actually have a really great, like at least 2 fact sheets on how to create a native bee house that's like beneficial. And a lot of it comes down to like making sure that you're putting a house out there that doesn't have like, it's not painted, it's, you know, natural wood, you've got the right size tubes, because that's a big one. A lot of the ones you see in the store, those tubes are huge, and all you're going to get in there are like spiders and wasps. So you got to make sure the tubes are the right size. It's got to be cleaned out like once a year after everybody emerges. And So yeah, there's definitely some best management practices there.
I thought it was sort of good to have some big ones so that you don't have somebody in every single hole, because
Yeah.
then it's just like a possum beast or something, right?
It can be.
Like if you don't want it to be that dense.
Yeah, yeah, and the way I like to do it at my house is I actually will just order those like bamboo tubes like online, and I'll get like a pack of 100 and I'll just bundle them and just in like maybe like 10 or 20, and I'll just kind of put them in like crooks of trees and like bushes around my yard. So like you said, they're not all, because there have been studies that have shown that those things do bring in disease because you have so many bees kind of commingling. So yeah, that's what I like to do. Yeah, it's tough. It's a great Girl Scout project though. So,
Then you gotta remember where to put them.
Yeah.
Finding Easter eggs.
oh, I always forget what mine are. Got one last question?
You're talking about mason bees, right?
Yes, yeah.
I started this last year and I have about 25 in the refrigerator.
Interesting,
Now,
okay.
I think, and I had to go through all the tubes and
Yeah,
pick out all the spiders and discard those.
right.
I'd say half of them came out okay. At least I think they're okay. And I took out the.
Yeah. Mhm.
Clean them off a little bit and put them in the refrigerator. And I'm trying to think. I mean, a lot of times I'll miss the deadline to put them out. I think this is about the time, another month, right?
It is.
And I can't believe you put them just out back in the nest.
Yeah, I would put it back in like a tube, basically. So what he's talking about is something, sometimes people will either take the tube or take the cocoons out of the mason bees and put them in their fridge, because then they have like a stable environment. You know, they're gonna have their best chance of like bees in the fridge.
They won't hatch it premature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now it's really like in the next 2 weeks, I bet. Last week of February, maybe first week of
Hatch
March.
it right first.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. It's a good little book I have, too, I can't remember where I got it.
Crown bees is a good resource.
Yeah.
Crown bees is a good resource.
Is that a website or is it a book?
It's a company.
Oh, it's a
They
company.
sell the tubes. That they're-
Oh, okay.
And they have a lot of procedures. They do have, they have good videos.
Nice. Well, thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, Celia.
Appreciate your.